A body burns, and the smell of death rises in clouds of ash above the steppes, ghats alongside the river, reaching for promised moksha, salvation. This death, now reduced to charcoal flakes, gently falls down onto the still waters of the Ma Ganga, otherwise known as the Mother Ganges. Here in Varanasi, India, 200 bodies will be burned today, an earthly end to a spiritual journey in a world of death. They will smell it on the banks of the river, in the center of town, riding on the back of a rickshaw. These 1 million people who call Varanasi home will live their lives neighbors to death. Varanasi, the city where a Hindu wishes to die. Because according to Hindu scripture, one who is buried and cremated on the banks of the Ganges River breaks the cycle of rebirth and attains enlightenment, freedom from our earthly existence. Varanasi, the city where 2 million tourists will travel to each year, their eyes holding an unspoken longing to move closer to death. Because for many, death is an unwelcome stranger. Here, in this Western world, in my middle-class, white, Mennonite America, death has too often been an unwelcome stranger, an untouchable, denied, feared piece of human existence. I still remember the few days I spent in Varanasi, India with my friend Samriddhi from New Delhi. I had read about the significance of the Ganges River to Hinduism, and I was intrigued by a place where life continued on in the midst of death, where living bodies bathed in the waters that had just cleansed those who had passed, where life and death were celebrated together in this complex reality of what it means to be human. Granted, my trip to India and to Varanasi came at a time 6 months prior to the COVID-19 outbreak. I had not yet witnessed death on such a large scale permeating through a culture, but I still held lots of personal experiences with death from my childhood. 7 funerals for family members before I was 16. For me, death has always been a part of my family and a part of my life. It's been breathed into the language we share together. We are human. We will die. We are dust. Death, a part of my family, but a part of my culture. I was not prepared for what I'd see those days in Varanasi, for what my eyes would see through a white, middle-class lens. There, in that place, death was mourned for sure, but it was also celebrated year-round, and not because the time of grieving was over, because a pandemic had passed, because the death rate was falling, but because we will all die someday, and we must create room in our culture and in our language to acknowledge that. In the last year, during this coronavirus pandemic, I believe we have witnessed our own version of Varanasi, living while surrounded by death in all its forms. Over 486,000 Americans lost to the coronavirus, over 2 million deaths around the world. How do we make peace with death while we are still living? How do we reclaim death in a white-dominated society that gives us the illusion that those in power can control and even avoid death? I approach this question the best way I know how, through the medium of language, because how can we make peace with death if we don't create space to talk about it with others, and if we don't question the tension between our death and our presence here on earth? We must reimagine a different language for making peace with death. Some would say that this American language that myself and many of us speak is already filled with the vocabulary of death. You're killing it. Drop 'em dead. Knock 'em dead. Drop dead gorgeous. I slayed that. In fact, author Ocean Vuong says one has to wonder what it is about a culture that can only value itself through the lexicon of death. We speak the language of death almost daily, but in a violent way, and we can't claim it. We can't honor it in a way that acknowledges our grieving and our humanness. And I wonder if this language of death, polluted with violence, only perpetuates our fearful relationship with death. Even Mennonite theology marries the idea of death to sin, a conception widely shared in other major church traditions as well. We're taught to avoid sin, and in turn, I think we're taught to avoid death. In Article 7 of Mennonite Church USA's Confession of Faith in a Mennonite Perspective, it reads, "Because of sin, humanity has been given over to the enslaving powers of evil and death." A footnote then reads, "We can't explain away sin by blaming it on illness or by claiming we're victims of evil. But where does that leave room for the natural process of dying, one that is not connected to sin or to fear?" I think of my grandfather, who passed away last January from health conditions unrelated to COVID-19, but I remember going down to the basement in my grandparents' home and finding my grandfather in the wood shop, his whole body covered in sawdust, his black slippers peeking out, and he didn't brush the sawdust off. No, instead, I saw my grandfather leaning in, the sandpaper in his hand, back and forth, making progress on his wooden coffin. My grandfather built his own coffin, my grandfather's too, and while I thought it strange at the time, I'm learning that this is how my grandfather spoke the language of death into being. In his wood shop was where he accepted his own mortality. And I think of the places where death has lived this past year, begging to speak. As I stood with my sign protesting the death of Breonna Taylor this past summer, I heard a new language, a language that acknowledged the reality of life and death all in one. A loud, peaceful language, a Black Lives Matter language, a let me breathe language, a language that said we must all talk about death. What I saw those few days in Varanasi, India, was a surrendering to the reality of death and to the lessons it has to teach us. Because death is not the great equalizer, and when it speaks to the injustices of our world. Speaking of death, making room for the suffering and discomfort that accompanies it, the inequality of it in our nation and around the world will not always be peaceful. But we must make peace with its impending reality. We must counter its current violent and unequal existence in our language and create rooms for reinterpretation of it within the walls of our institutions and our churches. Only then will we learn not to fear it. In her New York Times article, "It's Time to Talk About Death," Dr. Sunita Puri writes, "Talking about death is ultimately talking about life, about who and what matters to us and how to live well even when we are dying." If anything, this past year has awakened us to the fact that we die. So how can we make peace with death, transforming the language of violence and inequality in our nation? Let's reimagine death with words. Let's shape grief with language embodied, one that does not see life as the opposite of death, but sees life instead as an invitation to wholeness, one that calls us to take action. Let's rewrite our confessions of faith to make death not only a result of theological sin, but a result of injustice, of inequality, of our earthly bodies returning to dust. Let's listen for the ways death is speaking to those of us still living. Even tomorrow on Ash Wednesday, a tradition observed in the Western Christian Church, we will use the ash of palm branches to mark a cross on our foreheads, reminding us of our mortality, a cyclical remembering that begs to be honored. A body burns, and the smell of death rises in clouds of ash above South Main Street in Goshen, Indiana. Across from Goshen College, the Yoder Culp Funeral Home's crematorium is running today, a reminder that we too live beside death. We too are human. We too will die. We too are dust.